Interesting. All right, great.
Yeah, you do.
So first of all, thank you, Max, Roman, for organizing this. Not thank you so much for us having to bring up all the chairs here and the microphones. It's third year here, and I'm really happy to be here. You're kind of obligated to have me because I'm an investor in Hodl Hodl, so I get privilege. So let me introduce myself. I go by Whale Panda on Twitter. I'm a trader and investor, and I will let the other panelists introduce themselves. Jimmy?
I'm Jimmy, the Asian Bitcoin cowboy guy. Yeah, that's me.
That was what I was going to be before I did the lion, but you took it. So I'm Samson Mow. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Blockstream and the lion in Magical Crypto.
Eric Voskuil. I'm a maintainer of Bitcoin, and I write and speak on crypto economics.
Hi, my name is Oleg Andreev. I'm a Bitcoin enthusiast. I have a couple of Bitcoin open source projects, and I work as a protocol architect at Stellar.
So let me first off, we're starting with the unpopular opinions in Bitcoin, but it actually turns out that most of the unpopular opinions are quite popular. I picked the topics just I posted on Twitter, and a lot of people replied, and there's also an old thread from Nick Carter, who was a speaker here last year, who had like 200 different unpopular opinions. And I asked the panelists, I gave them a list of 20 and asked them to choose what they want to discuss. And the first one that came up was from Jimmy. It's on personal safety, specifically kidnapping. It becomes much more of an issue when money is decentralized and unconfiscatable. I mean, this week there was also in the news a guy in Norway, a Bitcoin millionaire, who had to jump down a 2-story building just to get away from the guy with the shotgun. And I guess in the past it was not really that big of an issue. If someone kidnaps your kids, you can, like, if you transfer money from the bank, it can be frozen. If you ask for cash, that's a huge logistical issues. So how do you see this develop? Do you see it as a big threat? Should we go all like full lob, or how do you see that happening?
Yeah, so the big issue right now is if you are Bill Gates and you have billions and billions of dollars, if somebody kidnaps you, I mean, very practically speaking, transferring them some amount of value is quite difficult. I don't know if you know this, but something like if you take $5 million in $100 bills, that's over 100 pounds, right? It's very heavy. It's extremely difficult, and you need that level of coordination. So if you're trying to take $1 billion from Bill Gates, that's going to be like a ton, like literal metric ton of cash that you have to bring around, and of course they're all going to be marked, and it's going to be very, very hard to spend. So the physical nature of cash makes that sort of thing very difficult to do. But now you have Bitcoin. Well, it's not just all of the OG Bitcoiners that have billions of dollars that are in danger. Now you have more motive as Bitcoin gains liquidity and there's more money for billionaires like Bill Gates to be kidnapped, because now the financial system can't necessarily protect them from that sort of thing, and you have to think a lot more about personal security and things like that. So that's, I think, the argument that I wanted to make with respect to this. I'm curious what the other panelists think, if they disagree or whatever.
It's too early for this. Well, technically, if you want to kidnap Bill Gates, you could also ask for it in Bitcoin too, right?
Right. So I'm saying that it's both for pretty much anybody. This becomes more of an issue because the option to transfer value is there without needing any physical exchange.
Yeah, but the other thing too is if you're holding Bitcoin, maybe you're more likely to keep it at home, like on a hardware wallet or something, and you don't have a really cold backup, or you didn't split your seed or something, or there's many options you can do to protect yourself. But the problem still is if people know you have Bitcoin, then you're still at risk no matter what. It's just like if people know you're a billionaire, then you're also at risk too. But I don't think it matters if it's Bitcoin or centralized fiat.
Yeah, I think it's just commonly that the advantages of a system also tend to be its disadvantages. It's easy to move the money, so it's easy to move the money. That's just the way it is.
Yeah, or you just give away your bitcoins and it kind of helps decentralization, right?
Okay, the second popular opinion, that was actually one thing I replied to Nick Gardner's thread, is that the majority of people should use a custodial wallet or service or exchange, since they're not really responsible enough or tech-savvy enough to manage their own keys or seeds. So, like Oleg, for example, how you see this issue? If we, like, do you see this as a bigger issue also with on layer 2, with most people using custodial wallets, or how you see that happening?
So my approach is to kind of use the strengths of the protocol. So you have multi-sig, so you have to use it like as much as possible. And a few years back, I came up with this kind of unique protocol for blind signatures in Bitcoin that allows you to spread, control of your coins, among the friends. And the blind part helps with them kind of co-signing your transaction when you ask them without knowing what they're signing. So you can imagine a wallet where you kind of spread the risk of holding the secret information among your friends as custodians, and their only job is to authenticate your face or like your presence. And the blinding part makes sure that they are not aware of like how much you have and what is the transaction that they're signing.
So do you guys see this as a big issue or not? Like, for example, if I look at my parents, I manage their Bitcoin. They ask me to buy Bitcoin, I buy Bitcoin. I don't see them using their own Trezor or Ledger or Cold Card or whatever. So will this cause an issue for the future?
We can solve it with like decent UI in the application. You don't need them to like learn the words and stuff. It could be as like easy as a messenger application.
So I think there's a different utility for different segments of the population, and custodial solutions are okay for some segments that are not that savvy. And I think it's always going to be that way until the tech solutions can catch up in their ease of use.
Yeah, it looks like it's correct right now. That I agree with that statement right now. But I mean, if you think about just sort of human history, people have the capacity to learn, and I think that's going to happen eventually. It might take a very long time, but people didn't know how to store their gold before, and they came up with solutions and ways to store it and in their house. I mean, even like if you live in America, like if you have a gun, well, you need to make sure it's locked up in a gun safe or something like that. And there's there are ways to train people to figure out like the best practices that will work for them. The key though is that it is a bearer instrument, and there is a lot of personal responsibility that goes into having to secure it yourself, and that's not something that people are used to. Frankly, we're used to outsourcing all sorts of responsibility into other spheres so that they can take care of it for you. It's very much sort of that nanny state mentality. But as Bitcoin comes and becomes a more prominent part of everyone's lives, this is one of the things that we have to get used to. We have to get used to having more personal responsibility over our stuff. Is it always going to be on custodial services and stuff like that, where you're outsourcing the security to somebody else, and also opening up a security hole for yourself by trusting a third party? I hope not. The hope is that people start being their own bank instead of using Coinbase as their bank or something like that. But it's going to take some time until tech solutions and people get used to the idea of having that personal responsibility for themselves.
It's kind of like what you said. It's like a spectrum. You have to first relearn that you have to store your own money, right? And then there's the last part, which is how to store your own Bitcoin.
Okay. So the third unpopular opinion was proposed by Eric. Bitcoin is a black market money. But I don't actually think that's a very unpopular opinion. I know you did a talk about that recently in Amsterdam, I believe. Someone told me about it. So
a couple times.
You want to discuss it a bit?
Well, the idea is that Bitcoin's security model doesn't provide any security for white market activity. So by design, it's a black market money. The resistance or the aspects of it that make it secure are there so that it can operate when it's not allowed. It's permissionless, that's what we mean. So it's very easy to take away permission. There's no security against that except popularity, the vote, but we have that. That's the status quo. That's how other monies work. So Bitcoin is designed to operate without permission, and that's the only way you can do it, if you do it without permission. So that's the principle. That means it's not specifically the idea that it's designed for use in other black market activity. It is itself intended to work when it's not allowed.
Yeah, in a sense, that whole phrase, black market money, is kind of a modern phenomenon. I mean, before, when we were on the gold standard, there was no permission involved in using money. We're only used to that because fiat central banking money is much more prominent nowadays. There was no permission associated with money. It implies a permission giver or some central authority. When you have decentralized money, the whole thing becomes an oxymoron. There is no black market or white market. There's just a market, period. And there's no permission being given or being sought. That's a modern phenomenon with sort of the nanny state stuff that we have today.
I tend to agree with Jimmy. I think it's the same concept as like clean and dirty money, right? It's like good markets and bad markets. And this is just phraseology that's been put into the establishment to kind of help control the flow of money. But in an ideal world, it's just a market and it's just money.
You have something to add, Oleg?
It's kind of hard to add anything to this. It's pretty accurate. Thank you.
So good.
Okay. So the fourth unpopular opinion is going to be Samson's favorite, and Jimmy's also, I think.
Wait, say that again?
One of your favorite opinions. Credit cards are awesome and way better to spend than Bitcoin. We talked about it a couple of times on our show as well. So Samson, tell us why you're so obsessed with credit cards and why it's so awesome compared to Bitcoin.
Well, credit cards are great. It's only second to Tether. But you know, you can collect points on a credit card. If you're traveling, they have like luggage insurance. If you get charged something, you can a fraudulent charge, you can cancel that charge. It's just great. What do you think, Jimmy?
Well, they're a remnant of the fiat system, and while we can take advantage of it, I think we should. In a sense, it's all of the advantages of a credit card are towards the consumer side, right? It's not for the merchant. And the idea is the Keynesian mentality of spending is good, just get everyone to spend, even if you're giving all of the advantages just to the consumer and not the merchant. And while we have that, it's not going to be like that at a certain point when Bitcoin's the most prominent money. Until then, like taking advantage of that makes all the sense in the world. And I've made this argument before. It's economically rational to use a credit card because of all the benefits that you're getting. You're getting points, you're getting like 25 to 45 days of float on your money. You get the appreciation of Bitcoin during that time if you're holding Bitcoin instead. If you're spending Bitcoin, well, it's irrevocable, right? Like they don't have to give it back. And you know, if something breaks, there's no, like all of the consumer protections that you get out of a credit card, you lose as soon as you use Bitcoin. And there are ways to get both. If you want to spend Bitcoin, you can. You just pay your credit card with the Bitcoin by selling it at the end of the 25 to 45 days of float that you get. So
like a settlement layer.
Yeah, and it's more like digital gold, right? Like you can have gold and you can just sell it whenever, and that's
what's your favorite credit card?
My favorite? I mean, I have several, but I usually churn them based on like whatever rewards I'm getting. So yeah.
I like my Amex card.
The platinum one? Is that like
so you're still sponsored by AXA and Amex? Okay.
Definitely.
Well, actually, one of the things that came up when we discussed it is also because we still earn everything in fiat money. So we just spend what we earn, and we keep our Bitcoin. We hold our Bitcoin.
Yeah. Well, I think there's something to be said about like going all in on Bitcoin too, and being able to do that. And if you know, if there were good solutions for taking your paycheck in Bitcoin, essentially, even if you get paid in fiat, just like convert it right away, there's a certain degree of appreciation that you're going to get during these bull runs that make up for any downsides that you might get during the bear run. So It ends up that 25 to 45 days of float, that actually matters quite a bit, because like a lot of times Bitcoin will double or triple during those times. Sometimes it might go down 85%, but overall it ends up being beneficial to you.
So Eric, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I mean, the question kind of inherently conflates, or it implies anyway, that we're comparing Bitcoin to credit cards, but Bitcoin is money and credit cards are credit, right? So they're apples and oranges. There will be credit on Bitcoin if it's used as a money. Credit always expands on money purely as a function of time preference. So whether it's a card that you swipe, whatever, there's going to be credit. So I don't think it's really a rational comparison, to compare money with credit.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's just a comparison that we hear all the time, obviously.
Well, to be fair, I think credit cards, all USD is essentially debt that comes from the central bank. It's like mostly M2 money anyway. So in a sense, it's kind of comparable because so much of the money is newly printed. And when the bank issues you credit for a credit card transaction, that money didn't exist before. They're issuing new money, essentially. So in that
new
way,
credit.
It's kind of comparable. It's not like Bitcoin, where if you issue credit for Bitcoin, like it has to be fully backed. Otherwise, somebody is going to get screwed at some point.
Well, credit cards are just like a kind of a utility. It's an access point into the fiat payment rail system, and it's really convenient. Most merchants have it. So I flew in through Moscow. I paid with my credit card in Moscow. I set up the Bolt app because I think everyone uses Bolt here. I linked it to my card, but it's just a matter of convenience, and you can still use Bitcoin if you want at the end of the day.
So that actually brings us to the next unpopular opinion that I found actually in Nick Carter's thread. So Bitcoin banks are appropriate and inevitable, as is credit creation on Bitcoin. So you see, is that the future, credit creation on Bitcoin?
I think so. I mean, there's always a market for people that want to get money now and pay back more later. But the big important thing to realize is that, at least in fiat currency, the interest rate reflects the rate of newly issued money. With Bitcoin, it's existing money. It's not really money creation per se that it is in the fiat world, where all debt issued is more or less newly printed. So because of that, the interest rates are going to be really, really different. Right now, you almost have like negative interest rates in a lot of countries. That means that there is a tremendous amount of money being printed. And that's how central banks push out money into the system. With Bitcoin, that system doesn't exist. So credit is inevitable, but it's not going to be 0.1% or negative 0.5% or whatever it is. It's going to be the real cost of money, the real time preference difference, or the cost of future money or whatever, and that's going to be more like 7, 8, 9%. And that's going to be very different, but it will exist. I agree with that. Banking services certainly will probably exist as well. Not everyone's, again, comfortable possessing their own money or being personally responsible and so on. So they'll have to learn the hard way when one of these banks fails.
Okay. But anything to add?
You imagine a Bitcoin world, right? There's no production without credit, right? Money gets lent to production. So there will be lending of Bitcoin, there will be no products in that world. And we shouldn't confuse what we see as bank interest, which is subsidized by various forms of tax, including inflation, with the economic rate of return on capital. It is around 10% if you invest broadly in everything. That's about what you get. Bank rates are subsidized by the taxpayer. That's not the economic rate of return. So we shouldn't confuse those two things. But if there's Bitcoin as a money and it's going to be used broadly as a money, there will be people lending it, call them banks or call them what you will. On a free market, there's no distinction between somebody lending and a bank lending. So it'll be necessary for any production to occur.
Also, in addition to that, since the interest rates will be higher, and at the same time it will be easier to save, like kind of keep your own personal savings, there will be less of a kind of VC money in production and more of a, private businesses. So more people would be able to just make their own savings and invest in what they believe directly and not through some, kind of roundabout way through, index funds or through a lot of hands of bureaucrats. So there will be kind of much more production in the private hands that invest their own money and not like someone else's money, I imagine.
Like a DAO?
I don't know.
Okay, moving on. We should change the default unit to Satoshis instead of full Bitcoin. And I mean, most of us, or many of us here in Europe, went through the change to the euro and stuff like that. I mean, it only makes sense. We're used to working with big numbers as well, like 100 million Satoshis, that's fine. So why aren't we moving from BTC or Mbits to just Satoshis?
Why aren't we using Esperanto? I mean, you can't force everybody to take up terminology just by central decree. That's not how Bitcoin works. I mean, I speak as like the author of BIP 176, where I was trying to get the word bits to be something that is more standard. I mean, you can't force anything on anyone in Bitcoin. And unfortunately, Bitcoin, the term means 100 million Satoshi, but that's the unit that everyone's familiar with. That's where the Schelling point has been. Can we change that Schelling point to something like Satoshis? Maybe eventually, but I don't know. Like in the US at least, we still don't even use the metric system. And that's the power of language. You just can't, you can't force people, no matter how much you want them to do the rational thing.
I think you can just use both. I mean, for the Lightning Network, everyone's still using sats. And sats is kind of like the unit of account for Lightning, like when you're tipping or buying small stuff. But I don't see it likely that we're going to switch from one to the other, from BTC to sats. But the interesting thing that exchanges could do is list another asset, which is sats, and a separate price. And then people will just buy sats because they're so cheap, right? But that doesn't really impact BTC.
Yeah, I would love to combat unit bias that way, and I blame Ripple and Stellar and all these other ones that have like tiny valuations for confusing a lot of people, but those people are learning some pretty expensive lessons now, aren't they? So, in a way, it corrects itself.
I think people should do whatever they want to do. That's the point.
Yeah.
Whenever anybody asks me what people should do, that's always my answer.
And with Bitcoin, they will.
Yeah. So Bitcoin needs to be more than a store of value, to be money, and to hold significant value in the long run.
I mean, by definition, store of value is holding significant value. So you're saying it needs to be more than a store of value to be a store of value. That seems kind of like saying X is greater than X or something. It seems on its face to be false, just logically. That said, yeah, is it going to be used as method of payment or something like that? I mean, maybe eventually. I mean, there are projects on the way that'll make it that way, but I don't think it needs to be more than what it is to be extremely useful and something that's a major add to the entire world. So I don't know if I agree.
I'm just gonna guess the subtext to that is like the Bcash argument, which is if it's just a store of value, it's not gonna go anywhere in the future. That's why it needs to be cheap fees and medium of exchange and whatnot. And there is some merit to that. Like if it only exists as a store of value or medium of wealth transfer, and it's questionable, like what happens down the road if there's not a lot of transaction volume? Because if it's just a lot of really rich people moving blocks of $100 million around, then the growth is somewhat limited, I guess. I mean, you can make the counter argument that gold has no real usage outside of being gold and being stored in central bank vaults. But I think I don't see we'll have that issue with Bitcoin because there is so much more utility and so much more exciting stuff being built around it, like the Lightning Network and sidechains.
Well, you can't store value. You can only store stuff, right? Even if it's virtual stuff, you can only store stuff. And value is subjective, right? So you're only storing what in the future somebody might give you for it, right? You're not storing value. So that ability to trade it for something else is what makes it useful to people. So really, you're only storing that potential to trade it now or in the future.
Also, it seems like in the question, the cause and effect is somewhat like reversed from reality. Like all these, other uses, they come when there are, a sufficient amount of accounts holding these tokens, and then people can just, trade them because they are willing to hold it, right? If you only have 1% of population holding Bitcoin and the rest doesn't care, then it's kind of hard to use them. But if more people are willing to hold, then all these other use cases will just naturally, come up on top of that.
But then you have the gold argument, which is you have 7.5 trillion market cap for this yellow metal that no one really does anything with.
But gold does not fly over telegraph, right?
Well, the vast majority of the gold that's mined today gets used in jewelry. I mean, it's not unused for stuff.
No, it's not. That's not true.
It's the new gold mine.
No. The gold that goes to India for being made into jewelry is a tiny fraction of the flow of gold. The flow of gold is somewhere around like 2% of the existing stock, and there is some new jewelry, but a lot of that jewelry is also being melted down and made into bars again. So
who has gold jewelry? Raise your hand. Okay, there's like 10, 12 people.
But they sold all the gold for Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Well, so I want to go back to what Eric said, which is that value absolutely is subjective, but the value of everything is subjective. It's based on what people will pay for it. But there's a certain thing about scarcity that makes value a little more certain, or at least more desirable. If it's actually scarce, then people trust its scarcity over time a little more. And subjectively, at least based on how humans work, that means it'll store value better. So there is a subjectivity to the value, but there are certain things that make like water's a lot worse as a store of value than something like gold, which is very hard to produce and much less plentiful. So there are certain properties, and it's not purely because of it's completely subjective, so we don't know what the value will be in the future, and therefore it's completely useless unless there's some other use case, like with water, somebody can drink it or something like that. The scarcity is the main property that makes something a better store of value or something that's not, and that's there's other stuff like fungibility and portability and all this other stuff, but demand. The main thing is that you just because it's subjective does not mean that there are objective properties of something that contribute to its utility as a store of value.
That's deep.
Okay, let's do the last one. Fees will be too high for the average user to do on-chain transactions if the price keeps going up, and that will force them to use layer 2 solutions, which are mostly custodial at the moment.
They might be right now, but I mean, this is kind of like trying to project into the future in sort of a very linear way, which is the most annoying thing about future predictions, at least for me. It's okay. Well, currently it's like this, so therefore we can project linearly and say its fees are always going to be this way or that way. I mean, this annoys me to death when people make projections based on that. Right now we're using this much, and therefore when we have 3 times the population, we'll use 3 times as much. It takes out any sort of entrepreneurialism, any sort of creativity, any sort of like market dynamics that happen as a result of price pressure and things like that. So yeah, right now, a lot of layer 2 solutions are custodial, but it's not always going to be that way. I mean, if there's a demand for something else, and if people are creative enough, and there's plenty of motivation to create new things in this space, and especially if there's a profit to be made, then you have, people coming up with new stuff that'll try different things, and we have no idea what's going to become popular. The whole like Bitcoin itself just sort of rose out of almost nowhere, right? Like I mean, when Satoshi created it, and you have different things that come into the market that change the game entirely. And that's the point of entrepreneurialism. And you know, the question sort of like assumes, or the statement kind of assumes that you won't have any of that. And it's possible that it becomes a settlement layer and there's other things, but it's also possible that there's an innovation that we find that nobody ever thought of. And like trying to project what innovations might be is a fool's errand. And you know, that's what I'm going to say about it.
Okay.
So, I don't know. I think if you have a mix of custodial and non-custodial, or centralized, non-centralized, it's still okay. So I'm just going to show Liquid right now. So you have the Liquid sidechain, which is sort of custodial, right? There is a federation of members that are holding the LBTC and the multisig. But that's actually okay. Like, a lot of people criticize Liquid because they said it's a centralized thing, but it is a centralized thing meant to facilitate trade for traders who would otherwise be storing their Bitcoin on exchange. But instead of storing on one exchange, now it's in a federation of 15 or more exchanges. So it just depends on the purpose of the usage. And down the road, you could potentially have like a, I don't know, a merchant sidechain or something like that, where you put in maybe a couple $100 to buy stuff. And that would be a centralized solution too, but I think it's okay. But it's got to be a mixture of many things. So you have Lightning, sidechains, or whoever dreams of something else in the future will use that thing potentially.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, guys, for this talk, and hope you guys learned something new. Thank you.